mentioned back in disc 1 of season 9 that I thought that season 9 may be my least favorite episode of the series. Probably because most of these episodes I haven't seen as much as some of the previous episodes. Because when I went back and I watched The Slicer, believe it or not, I kind of liked The Slicer a little bit more than I thought I would. Because there was a few episodes in the previous disc that I was like, meh, like iffy about some of them. But to be honest, The Slicer had some good material. Stuff that I was like, I get this, I don't hate it. So it was a solid episode, I would say, for season 9. George starts his new job. Elaine has issues with her neighbor being away in Europe. Jerry dates a dermatologist. And Kramer plays both Slicer and brings back his Dr. Von Nostrad personality again in this episode as well. So, some interesting things happen in this episode, I gotta say. So we'll talk about it. The Slicer. So, first, Elaine has this dream that she was in bed with Jerry, George, and Kramer. Not sure why. But she wakes up and she hears an alarm. And she thinks it's hers, but she's pounding on her alarm clock and it's 3:30 in the morning. It's not hers, it's her neighbor's. However, her neighbor is out of the country in Europe. So, she really has no way of shutting off the alarm, and it kept her awake all night. So that frustrates her. Kramer, meanwhile, doesn't like the way how the coffee shop makes their sandwiches. He thinks he can do better. So he buys this big meat slicer that came in very good handy. Sliced meat, pretty darn good. And he ended up, just slicing some ham and whatnot, and it was just delicious. And he's been using it, throughout the whole episode. He then offers, though, Elaine a helping hand because, they go outside her neighbor's apartment where there is, sockets. He takes a paperclip, and of course he wanted Elaine to do the poking, but he said, fine, he'll do it. Of course, he doesn't, and he gets electrocuted, of course, to take out the power in her neighbor's apartment. Cool, and even though Kramer took a shock, it seemed to work. The only other problem, though, was Elaine's neighbor has a cat. So the cat starts meowing like crazy, and Elaine claims it's more annoying than the alarm. I would say the opposite. But the reason why the cat's meowing is because the cat's hungry. And the power shutting off also turned off the automatic feeder. So then Kramer cuts up a piece of meat for the cat to eat, and it seemed to satisfy the cat. Of course, then Elaine wants to borrow the slicer. First, Kramer's resistant about it, but then Elaine talks him into it and says, I'll cut a few slices, I'll give it back to you tonight. Of course, that does lead to some problems down the line. Meanwhile, Jerry is dating a doctor. And of course, I guess she gets on him a little bit about him being a comedian. And she mentions how it feels so good to be able to save lives. To which Jerry feels like that she's bragging about her career over his. George, though, says, why don't you take her on the revenge date to make her feel bad for doing that? Until you realize here that Jerry doesn't quite know what dermatology is. As, they take care of, the skin. And then, of course, it backfired when a patient of Sarah's, the name of the doctor, thanks for saving his life from skin cancer. So the whole revenge date blew up. Which leads to an end of the relationship, but Jerry is in need of her assistance afterwards. 1 second, sorry, I forgot to do something here. Usually I have to line it up. I was watching the inside looks. Anyways, okay. Because George would need her later. Because what happened with George was, George, still, of course, didn't work out a play now, still has no job since leaving the Yankees. He gets an interview at Kruger Industrial Smoothing, to which he gets hired. But then George panics, though, because he sees a picture on his boss's desk, and George is in the background of the picture. he realizes this is from his famous boombox incident back in 1989. So in 1989, George was at the beach. He had set his stuff up. He walked away for a second, came back. All of his stuff is gone. And I guess he was under this suspicion that the kids threw all of his stuff into the water. I guess he flipped out on them, got so mad he chucked their boombox into the water and ruined it, of course. The father, who ends up being Kruger, flipped out at him and told me he owed them the boombox. And what did he do? He gives him a fake address and drives away, never hears from him again. Well, now, of course, it's until now, as he's now George's boss. And George realized he has to find some way to get out of it. Well, then, and of course, he started talking about, another career for him. Similar to how back in the Revenge episode, whenever George lost his job for poisoning his boss, well, he originally quit because he was upset that his boss wouldn't let him use the private bathroom. So basically, they're doing like a throwback to that with, going over things he can do, and talking about something about the Coast Guard and other things. But then Kramer pitched the idea of, why don't you just air dry him out of there? You take him to a Photoshop, and they can remove someone out of the picture. Well, George takes it there, and they accidentally remove Kruger instead of George. Of course, he then takes the photo back. They remove George, but since Kruger was already gone, they basically put in a cartoon character in place of Kruger. Which, of course, as Jerry describes, that he looks like someone from the Peanuts cartoons. So he doesn't know what to do. The only way he can fix this is if he had a photo of Kruger shirtless to put right back in the picture. But then George realizes that the doctor Jerry's seeing, Sarah, she did a skin cancer screening at Peterman. So she's trying to get the idea of doing it at Kruger. Which, of course, Jerry apologizes to her, but she says, we're done. She goes, but I'll do the screen for your friend. But then Jerry starts getting this rash, all on his neck. And he thinks that it was the dermatologist gave it to him with, whatever chemicals and stuff she uses on her hands and whatnot. Of course, he walked in as she's about to start doing the screening on at Kruger's, and she gets pissed off at Jerry that she just walks out. Well, then Kramer, who was wearing a white coat at the time, Kruger, which we find out that Kruger Industrial Smoothing is not really the best place. It's very disorganized. People don't really care. Perfect environment for George, but again, George trying to avoid losing his job again. But Kruger is that clueless, he mistakes Kramer as a doctor. So Kramer poses as Dr. Von Nostrad, like he did 2 episodes. I mean, he did that twice whenever he wanted Elaine's chart. And then the episode where he had to try to get his mother's jacket back, I think it was. But anyways, he poses as him, and of course he gets the picture for the record. But then he legitimately does see a mole on Kruger. And of course, Kramer can't take care of it unless he used his slicer, which of course George's like, don't do that. But basically tells George he has to see someone because he's concerned that this mole's cancerous. And of course, then first he's telling George that he's got to come clean, tell him the truth. Like, I'm not doing that. I'm not going to lose my job. So how that gets settled, we'll get back to that in a second. Elaine, meanwhile, again, had borrowed Kramer's slicer to slice up some meat for the neighbor's cat. But then she realized that her heels were very uneven. So she thought, I can maybe use the slicer to, slice off part of my heels. Well, it then gets stuck in the slicer. And I guess it just dangles up the blade. So, of course, she had to borrow a pair of pliers, and she was worried that Kramer would find out. So, of course, when Kramer came to the door, wanting to get the slicer back, Elaine had to bang it against the wall for her heel to fall out. It does, but then, of course, whenever she answers to Kramer, says, I'm on the phone, she shuts the door, and then Kramer notices a dangled blade, realizes that Elaine's done something to it, but then he tries to get in, but her doorknob comes off, and he falls back into her neighbor's apartment. Which we find out is also the person who was making the potatoes. So everybody kept saying that her hallway smells like potatoes. But that's the reason why Kramer was at Kruger's the day when he was mistaken as a doctor, because they were fixing the blade on his slicer. They were smoothing it out for him. So Kramer's got to come clean. I mean, George's not going to come clean to his boss. Elaine then has troubles because, not only did Kramer's doorknob affect, from coming in, but then whenever she tried to get out to feed the cat, the other doorknob broke. So she's waiting for a locksmith to come, but the cat meow was annoying her so much she started playing loud music, and the neighbors were complaining and banging on her door. And then, of course, to stop her, they took out her power instead. So she had no power, but she had no way to get out of her apartment. So she's stuck. Kramer then finds this book to give to George that shows, what he thinks Kruger has. So, of course, he reads it, and then, George tries talking to Kruger, and, of course, Kruger does find out that George indeed was the person that, ruined his boombox, but he didn't care. And also, he wasn't concerned about the mole at all. Which, there's no follow-up on it, but there was that. But then Jerry, though, meanwhile, reads the book, too, and finds out what was causing his rash. It wasn't Sarah. It was Dr. Von Nostrad. Kramer. Now, how is this? It's because Kramer was using Jerry's towel, the same towel that he wipes his face and his chest with in the shower. He was using that same towel, he didn't know, to clean his slicer. The chemicals that he was using on the slicer is what was causing Jerry, and because Jerry's wiping that towel on his face, it was causing his skin to itch and get hives. So Kramer got busted there too. And then the episode ends with people sliding some ham underneath Elaine's door waiting for the locksmith. And Elaine even got thirsty. She stuck a little straw through the hole and started drinking from Kramer's Diet Coke. And that's the episode. And I thought this episode was... It was an episode I wasn't too excited to watch again because I hadn't really watched it in a long time. But I saw it and I'm like, hey, it's actually a little funnier than I thought. So I'll give this one credit as more of a thumbs up than I thought it was. And most of the episodes on this next disc actually aren't too bad. Not to me that really stand out great. There was a couple that I really liked. Like the next one, The Betrayal, was actually a really well done one. We'll talk about that next time. But before we go, there's a couple trivia. There's a story about when Jerry went on a vacation to Mexico, a photographer took his photo for $5, but then something went wrong with the photo and it required fixing. And then when the photographer showed Jerry the fixed photo, Jerry's image was replaced with a cartoon version of someone who had drawn on top of it, which inspired the whole story about the boombox incident story for this episode. And of course, Kruger was initially only meant to appear in just this one episode, but it was decided to make him a recurring character, so he appeared in four the last 18 episodes, I guess it was, for the remainder of the series, of course. Again, Kramer being as Dr. Von Nostrad was his alter ego in The Nose Job, with him trying to get back his mother's coat, and also in The Package in the previous season. Whenever she was trying to get Elaine's chart when the doctors were accusing Elaine of being difficult. Of course, there was a part in the episode also where Kramer was trying to go with Elaine to go back to her apartment to get his slicer back. But in order to stall Kramer from going, Elaine said she would stop at the circus. She's going to be seeing clowns, which revisits that Kramer was afraid of clowns. I mentioned the thing about, how whenever George was going to lose his job, they kind of did the contemplating about another job for him, just like they did back in Revenge. Of course, whenever George was freaking out on Kramer because of the mole on Kruger's shirt, Kramer marked George in his chart, which is also a reference back to The Package as well. And of course, while Elaine dances to the music, she does laundry. She plays that music to drown out the cat's sound. She dances, throwing back to the little kicks. Actually, also, the lady who played Sarah, the doctor, was played by Marcia Cross, who's a character on Melrose Place, which is a show that Jerry was being tortured about watching back in the Beard episode. And that's pretty much it. So yeah, the Slicer was a little bit better than I thought. I liked it a little more than I thought I would like it. So a good start to disc 2 of season 9. We have 17 more episodes left to review. Next up is The Betrayal. It is the backwards episode. And why is that? We'll talk about that next. It's a pretty good episode too. So guys, what were your guys' thoughts on the Slicer episode? Do you think it's kind of underrated too as well? Make sure to leave your thoughts down in the comments section below. And be sure as always to slap a like on the video and subscribe for more content on my channel. And follow me on Twitter as well at DemandAirboy93. And until then guys, I am checking out. I'll catch you all later. Have a great rest of your evening. Peace out everybody.